Hi, and welcome back. Today we're going to explore stress. What are some of our triggers and how do we react? And then we want to really explore, can we instead, when we have a trigger, learn how to respond instead? So we often find ourselves experiencing something that stresses us, so a trigger, an external event. So it could be the fact that there's a pandemic that could be triggering your stress response right now. It could be that you saw a spider and that triggers your stress response, or a mouse, or your kid has messed up the floor, or you've had an argument with somebody because they didn't like what you said. So we have some trigger, some external event that triggers us to respond. And often this happens so quickly that we don't even see that there was a thought process there. We jump in a reaction, so that something triggers us and we're so used to reacting in this way that it happens so fast we don't even realize that there's a whole series of processes in place. So before I get into that too much, I want to start by reading a poem. So inviting you to, once again, close your eyes if you're happy to do so, and lower your gaze if not, and just receive these words with your heart and your soul. The Guest House by Rumi. This being human is a guest house. Every morning a new arrival, a joy, a depression, a meaningness, some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Welcome and entertain them all, even if they are a crowd of sorrows who violently sweep your house, empty of its furniture. Still, treat each guest honourably. He may be clearing you out for some new delight. The dark thought, the shame, the malice. Meet them at the door laughing and invite them in. Be grateful for whatever comes, because each was sent as a guide from beyond. So just connecting with the breath and bringing your attention back to the room. So what I like about this poem is that it's really telling us that our emotions are messengers, trying to deliver a guide, trying to deliver a message that will help guide us in our actions. And sometimes we find it maybe hard to pick up on what they're trying to say. So how this all relates then to our stress triggers. So our stress trigger, what it will do when we have a trigger, it will actually create a sense of, I suppose, physical sensations in the body. So depending on what the trigger is, it could lead you to anger, anxiety, frustration, joy, happiness. But typically if we're talking about stress, it's not going to, joy, happiness isn't going to be the thing that it's leading us to. So when we look at the trigger and our reaction, it starts off almost like a sliding scale. So there's the stairs. At the bottom we have the physical sensation. So the physical sensation in the body, it could be a beating heart, rapidly beating because of the pressure or the worry. It could be butterflies in the stomach around anticipation. It could be any number of things, sweaty palms if you're about to get up and give a talk. So it could be any kind of physical sensation. So what we want to do is we want to break down our understanding of what's happening. So the physical sensation, then there's emotional tone. So the emotional tone can be that anxiety, that feeling of, oh my God, what the hell is going to happen next, or the anger, the frustration. And quite often we physically feel that in the body. So this is why we've been practicing the body scan, is to connect, get out of the head and get into the body, so we can register the physical sensations and register where the emotional tone is. So when we can connect with the emotional tone, there's a part of the practice where we look at, what does that feel like? Is it a sense of energy radiating out from the body? Is it a tightness in the chest? Is it a tightness in the shoulders? Can we pick up on where the emotion is in the body? And then we have a thought. So what does the thought say? Does the thought say, I'm not good enough? that person, I can't believe they said that, I'm so right and justified in what I'm saying? Or do we find ourselves judging ourselves, being very harsh and critical about what we've done, and how we've even reacted to it? So do we have that inner kind of critic or bully giving out to us that, oh, look at other people wouldn't react like this, why am I still caught in an emotional turmoil? So we want to start to separate it out. So if you imagine a bit like a dominoes, so if you have all your dominoes stacked up in a row, the finger is the stress trigger, and the stress response is when we hit that first domino over, and then it has a precipitative effect, so it knocks on another piece and another piece and another piece. So when we think about the trigger, there's actually space in between the trigger and the first domino, isn't there? And similarly with our own emotional reaction, there's space, but it typically happens so fast that we don't see it. We just see trigger, response, trigger, reaction, trigger, reaction. But as we practice more and more meditation and mindfulness and coming to be aware of what's happening in the present moment, as opposed to getting caught into the story of what this trigger means, and how I'm justified in maybe my reaction to it, or whatever your story is, the more we practice meditation, research shows that it actually slows down or dampens the amygdala in our brain. So the amygdala, if we come back to the brain, the hand model, so we've got the limbic system, and the amygdala sits in around here, and it acts a little bit like a post office sorting centre. It takes in the information, or a smoke detector takes in the information and decides if something needs to be done or not about it. And if something it perceives needs to be done, it will send a flood of information to the limbic system, and then that's where your emotional reaction will occur. So when the amygdala takes in this information and it decides that's a stress trigger and I need to react very quickly in getting angry or agitated or anxious or depressed or whatever the emotional tone and reaction is to that trigger, what we find is the more we practice meditation, it actually dampens down this amygdala activation and slows down the reactivity. So when we have the trigger, then it's almost like the more we practice, we can see the trigger and we can observe it and go, okay, now I have a choice. And initially, it may not feel like there's that much time for choice, but the more we practice, the more choice, the more time we have to choose. Okay, and maybe we stop reacting out of the patterns that we have been doing. So it's a little bit like if you have been burning a bonfire all your life in terms of how you react to maybe a sibling and what they say or do to you. And initially when you start practicing, it might take a bit of effort to stop throwing on logs on the fire. So if you imagine your reactivity, the trigger and the reaction, you're throwing a log on that fire. So the first time you do that, you start becoming aware of your reaction and you hold back. It's like you stop putting on a log on the fire. It doesn't mean that the fire has stopped burning, no, but it does mean that if we stop putting logs on the fire, it starts to dampen down and over time stops burning, so that the trigger over time stops triggering us actually, and we start to see and understand more what it is about maybe that person and they're doing, and we can relate to that a little bit differently. But first we must start by moving from reactivity to response. So I see this thing is bothering me, I see this thing is triggering me, I see that when I watch the news maybe before going to bed, I lie awake at night worrying about what's to come. So maybe I change my habits by not watching the news before I go to bed or looking at Facebook or social media. So I can change some of those things around me. Or maybe I observe, okay, this thing this person is saying, it's triggering me, and now I take a moment, I take a step outside and I count to 5. So a little trick that I teach my nieces and nephews is to hold your hand up and to breathe in as you bring your finger up, and breathe out. And breathe in 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 and breathe out. And then you've had 5 breaths. And sometimes that's just enough to take us back into the present moment and what's happening. So when we get a chance to connect to the breath, pause ourselves and observe the stimulus, the trigger, and what our reaction is, we can come back into the body and say, what would a wise response be? So getting out of the head, coming into the heart, what would a heartful, wise response be, as opposed to reacting? And sometimes that's to pull back and say nothing, and sometimes that may be to journal and to take time to process, what is it about this trigger that is triggering you? What is underneath it? Because there's always something underneath it. So is there a need that is not being met? Is there some fear? And to explore that. So to take a step back from the triggering event, connect for a few breaths, and then to the heart. And what is a wise response or a compassionate response to that situation? Okay, thank you. We'll talk to you tomorrow.